I mean, I don't know. I guess we just all have to kind of learn to live with the fact that Trump is very inconsistent. As you said, he's very unpredictable. He just doesn't stick to the script. And so, again, that's why, to me, I didn't actually think this week's stories on Ukraine were all such a big deal because, quite honestly, Trump is not really going to follow through. It's probably going to fall apart. I think you and I have had this conversation a couple times this year. I mean, it's just, I don't know if Trump is, I just don't know if he's going to really put in the effort. And he probably won't.
Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at the Pusan National University. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me again.
We've got to start off with, of course, this Bloomberg report that has revealed an audio file of Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, speaking to members of Putin's team from October 14th. So here's what the article says, Bob. It says, in an October 14th phone call that lasted a little over 5 minutes, Witkoff advised Yuri Ushkov, Putin's top foreign policy aide, on how the Russian leader should broach the issue with Trump. His guidance included suggestions on setting up a Trump-Putin call before Volodymyr Zelensky's White House visit later that week and using the Gaza agreement as a way in. So what was your reaction to reading this news?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of similar to what we've seen from Donald Trump regarding Putin and the people around Donald Trump, his coterie, particularly Witkoff, who seems to be kind of like this all-purpose envoy for whatever trouble's out there in the world, Gaza and the rest. And again, a lot of it is designed, first of all, a lot of it's designed around Trump's ego. I mean, it's pretty clear there's a lot of kind of like, how do you set this up and how do you flatter Trump and how do you convince him to sort of go for a deal because you make him an offer or something. I live in Korea and the Koreans did this kind of prep by giving Donald Trump a golden crown when he came to Korea, right? I mean, Trump is really vulnerable to this kind of flattery. And I would imagine that this is sort of something that the Russians are thinking about, right? I mean, how do we connect with Trump on the axis of his vanity, which has become like a really big issue in U.S. diplomacy. And so that's the first thing, right, is that this is really, really different than traditional diplomacy as opposed to making a kind of concrete deal or something. Instead, you're appealing to Trump's own ego. And the second thing, of course, is that this tells us what we've kind of known for a long time, which is that Trump just doesn't have a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainians. I kind of think he wants the Russians to win the war. I think Trump and the people around him are very wary of actually saying that publicly and openly because they don't want to be criticized so harshly in the media as they almost certainly would be. Polling in the West still continues to support giving aid to Ukraine. Even in the United States, Republican polling is, I believe, over 50% in terms of supporting Ukraine. Trump is pushing the ball uphill. He's rolling the ball uphill. And I think that's, and that constricts how much he can actually say publicly. But I think it's pretty clear from Trump's own behavior, his language on Twitter and so on, that he is comfortable with a Russian victory. I don't know if he'll be comfortable with, the Russians marching all the way to the border with Poland. I mean, I don't know just how much he's willing to accept, but I think it's pretty clear that Trump just doesn't object if the Ukrainians get defeated. And that's what Witkoff is sort of working with, right? He sees it as a real estate deal and the Ukrainians just have to give us some territory. And it just really flies in the face with the tradition of U.S. foreign policy of sort of helping states that have been attacked by, imperialists and dictators.
Trump, he responded to this audio leak. He said, I haven't heard it, but I heard it was standard negotiation. And I would imagine he's saying the same thing to Ukraine because each party has to give and take. Now, in terms of him saying Witkoff might be, prepping Zelensky for the way he speaks to Donald Trump, I mean, that might not be untrue, Bob, given that after Zelensky's big showdown with Donald Trump and JD Vance at the Oval Office in February, it did seem as if Zelensky was then coached onwards about how to approach Trump. So this, obviously, it's not the same thing in the sense that one is the aggressor and one is the victim, but this is probably exactly what's happening, that every, country, when they're about to meet Donald Trump, is kind of coached on how to speak to him.
Yeah, and again, I can just sort of use the Korean example because Koreans kind of in a similar position to Ukraine, which is to say that the forward democracy close to some very, very unpalatable regimes. The Koreans are kind of vulnerable if the Americans depart or the Americans exit the alliance, otherwise abandon South Korea. Korea would be pretty vulnerable. And the Koreans went all out on the flattery when Trump was in town for APEC about a month ago, right? I mean, the Golden Crown is what everybody saw on CNN, but there was a lot of discussion, like open discussion in the Korean media. I don't know if this was picked up in the West, but there was open discussion here about how to flatter Trump, how to tell him what he wants to hear. And, and he's this peacemaker. And I believe the South Korean president mimicked back to Trump this idea that he solved 8 wars and stuff, which, I mean, I don't think anybody in political science, what I do, actually thinks that's correct. I'm not sure what those conflicts are. But, South Koreans don't really care, right? You just tell Trump what he wants to hear. And that's the real problem professionally, right? Is that, if Trump is sort of open to such manipulation, right, then, who knows what you can talk him into, right? And this has been sort of a known issue with Trump, that he kind of tends to follow the lead of the last person to talk to him, right? And that's why I think there's always a sense that, sort of Zelensky gets the scraps from the table, and then the real deal is Trump talking to Putin. And that, of course, is the manipulation window. And I think that's what a lot of us have been worried about now for a while. And it seems like every time Trump sort of announces that he's going to do tough sanctions on the Russians or something, he has a phone call with Putin, or, Witkoff talks to somebody and then it doesn't happen. And this has been sort of a continuing cycle. And we see that in this recent 28-point plan, which, some people are saying like parts were translated straight out of the Russian. I mean, I can't speak to that, but again, this is kind of the same thing with him again and again, right? These plans fall through and ends up, Trump tilts towards the Russians. And so I don't actually know if this week is actually that different than anything we don't already know, because Trump just isn't making much of an effort, right? Because he seems to be comfortable with a Russian victory. And that's just, again, it's just so disappointing because it's so outside the norm for NATO behavior.
And the unpredictability of Donald Trump is very much shown in this audio file, because, of course, this audio with Steve Witkoff takes place on October 14, which is, just a couple of weeks, or, a few weeks after Donald Trump spoke at the UN General Assembly, where he declared that, Ukraine is winning the war, that they can win back all of the territory that they've lost to Russia. But what's most notable about this transcript with this discussion between Witkoff and the Russians is not only is he, coaching them on how to speak and pitch to Donald Trump, including suggesting that they even speak before Zelensky's meeting, but it also shows a complete kind of misunderstanding of Putin's goals, because Witkoff is there saying that he fundamentally believes that Russia has always wanted a peace deal.
I don't think anybody believes that anymore. Again, I don't know what kind of Trump information Trump is getting. I mean, again, if you follow the sort of professional literature on Ukraine, this has actually emerged as a big issue, right? It's like, who exactly is talking to the president that he believes these things, right? And again, I mean, we're sort of back to this same old issue, right? Which is that Trump doesn't listen to advisors. Trump is completely he's dissembled the National Security Council structure inside the U.S. government. For your viewers, what that is that's kind of like the interagency convening body that kind of brings together people from the Defense Department and the State Department and different elements, and tries to get them to sit down together and work on issues and sort of to generate a coherent U.S. policy response to some big issue. And Trump has taken that apart, and he sort of basically put foreign policy in the hands of his various retainers and cronies and whatever, most obviously Witkoff, who's just wildly unqualified to do this, or Pete Hegseth, who's wildly unqualified to be SecDef. And I think that's what you're seeing here, right? Is this kind of characteristic Trumpian, what's the word I'm looking for here? This kind of like winging it. He just kind of swings from policy to policy, depends on who he talks to and what he sees on Fox and what he reads on Twitter. And so it just leads to this wild swing back and forth in U.S. policy, a lot of inconsistency. Trump changes his mind all the time. We've seen this on the tariffs. One day the tariffs are up, then they're down. And you see the same thing with Ukraine. One day they're going to take back all the territory. The next day, here's a 28-point plan where the Ukrainians give up 20% of their territory. I mean, this is just, I don't know. I guess we just all have to kind of learn to live with the fact that Trump is very inconsistent. As you said, he's very unpredictable. He just doesn't stick to the script. And so, again, that's why, to me, I didn't actually think this week's stories on Ukraine were all such a big deal, because, quite honestly, Trump is not really going to follow through. It's probably going to fall apart. I think you and I have had this conversation a couple times this year. It's just, I don't know if Trump is, I just don't know if he's going to really put in the effort. And it's, he probably won't. And so, I imagine you and I will be having this conversation again, like next February.
That's exactly what one of my other guests says. He says, you and I have the same conversation, once a week, once every few weeks. But Bob, this leaked phone call with Steve Witkoff, it comes off the back of an interview that he's done with Tucker Carlson. He tells Tucker that he liked Putin. He said, I like him. I thought he was straight up with me. I don't regard him as a bad guy. Now, this coupled with the fact that General Keith Kellogg, a staunch supporter of Ukraine in Trump's inner circle, a rarity, in fact, will leave his post in January. So does Trump have enough people in his corner advising him and not falling for Russian propaganda?
That is an excellent question. My sense is that when Kellogg is out the door, I think that's a real loss. I think there's a wide consensus out there in the sort of pro-Ukrainian foreign policy community that that's a real setback. And part he's leaving apparently because he's being cut out by people like Witkoff, and Trump's not listening to him. Trump's listening to Vance and stuff. So that I think that's part of it, which kind of speaks to the general pro-Russian tilt of the White House, at least of the Oval Office. I think probably the last major voice around Trump who will push the Ukrainian position, or at least the sense that a total Ukrainian defeat would be a disaster for NATO. I think the person probably pushing that will be Marco Rubio, who is Secretary of State, and also I think he's acting national security advisor or sort of temporary. I'm not quite sure what exactly this sort of he's in this weird limbo. This is very common with Trump, right? You get these sort of like weird limbo positions. Um, and so, but Rubio is a fairly traditional Republican hawk, right? I mean, Rubio is opposed to Trump's rise back in 2016. You can go find on Twitter Rubio saying things like, Trump will be a disaster for the GOP. And Rubio, he was fairly hawkish during Iraq and stuff like that, back in the day. And so I think, Rubio probably would like to see the U.S. do more. But, again, he's sort of in a bureaucratic knife fight, if you will, back in the White House against these various opponents. And that's, I don't know how much time we have for this, but that's something else that's very characteristic of Trump, right? Is he kind of throws policy to like this mix of advisors and cronies and friends, Jared Kushner and Rubio and Vance, and they all kind of like had this big bureaucratic battle. And Trump kind of stands back and watches it rather than arbitrating, which is what the whole National Security Council process was designed to do, to prevent White Houses from collapsing into empire building and factionalism. And we saw that during the Bush years when Rumsfeld and Cheney just, and Colin Powell just clashed over everything. And Trump seems to revel in that. The problem is that leads to wildly inconsistent U.S. foreign policy. I mean, I just don't understand why Trump has taken apart the National Security Council process. I mean, I don't know why, but without that, you just get what we're talking about, these wild swings, which again, so at this point, I think we're all used to. So it's like, I mean, is Trump going to stick to a deal they brokers this week? I mean, who knows, right? I mean,
Well, the consensus seems to be that, as you said, Marco Rubio is a little bit more pro-Ukraine and helping out, but JD Vance is on the opposing side. But I mean, what's been one of the more interesting points in the last few weeks is this divide in the Republican Party, with so many Congress people in the Republican Party coming out and not so much shading Donald Trump. They're really watching their wording, but they're saying that the United States has to be firmer. But I mean, just on the note of Steve Witkoff, Bob, Republican Congressman Don Bacon, he said this. He said, for those who oppose the Russian invasion and want to see Ukraine prevail as a sovereign and democratic country, it is clear that Witkoff fully favors the Russians. He cannot be trusted to lead these negotiations. Would a Russian paid agent do less than he? He should be fired.
Yeah. And I think this really gets to sort of the core problem that Donald Trump and MAGA, to the extent that MAGA is pro-Russia, is having on this conflict, right? I mean, if you look at the public opinion polling in the United States, it's actually pretty pro-Ukraine. I think there's a pretty strong perception that Putin is the bad guy in this, right? I mean, to me, it's actually pretty obvious, right? I mean, Russian tanks rolled across the border. I mean, to me, the moral question here is actually pretty simple. It's pretty black and white. You got the Russians kidnapping children and bombing cities. I mean, the Russians are the bad guys in this, which is to say Putin's circle, right? Not the Russians themselves, but the Putin government. And so, and I think again, Trump is sort of fighting back against what seems to be the pretty obvious sort of moral clarity of the war, to use sort of an older term, which is that the Russians are the villains, the Russians are the invaders, and public opinion reflects that, right? There's pretty strong support, even again inside the Republican Party, and a lot of these guys on the Hill, they're sympathetic to Trump, but you got a lot of pre-Trumpers. You got a lot of people who remember the Republican Party from, Trump's only been around for 10 years. You got a lot of guys who've been in there for longer, and they remember the older days when the Republican Party was variously neoconservative or hawkish or anti-Russian or whatever. Mitt Romney, as late as Mitt Romney, Mitt Romney said Russia was America's biggest opponent. That wasn't that long ago. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety on the Hill to sell out Ukraine. There's a lot of sort of desire to help them. That's been muted because of this kind of personality cult style relationship that Trump has with MAGA. His base loves him, and Trump uses that to threaten congressmen who defect, right? We saw that with Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? I mean, she's on her way out because of this clash, right? But the more Trump slips in the polls and stuff, right? The Democrats won a big victory just a couple weeks ago. The more room there is for Republican congressmen to push back on the president. And it's pretty clear when it comes to foreign policy, they really want the United States to do more on the Hill. Lindsey Graham and others, we've discussed this before. So Trump's in a tight spot, right? The Hill doesn't really like what he's doing, right? Even Republicans on the Hill don't like, and public opinion is pretty supportive, and Trump is still trying to sort of like weed his way through that. And I just don't know how long he can do this, right? I mean, if we get a recession next year, which I think is possible because of the tariffs, Trump's approval rating is going to fall closer to 30, and then he's really going to be in bind on things like tariffs and Ukraine.
Now, we don't know exactly what is in the details of this draft agreement between the US and Ukraine that was agreed upon yesterday. We know it's a 19-point plan, but we know that the US believes that this could all come down to territory. So this is part of the audio file with Steve Witkoff and the Russians, was that he said, now me to you, I know that it's going to take I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal, Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere, but I'm saying instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopeful, because I think we're going to get a deal here. So if Ukraine makes some sort of land concessions, Bob, whether it be that 20% that Russia occupies, whether it be leaving Crimea to Russia, whether it be letting Russia have that 88% of Donbass that they control, whether it be even just a slither of the eastern region, how confident are you that any sort of land concession would ignite a third invasion down the track?
Yeah, and that's really the problem, right? If you could predict that the Russians would follow a deal, it might be worth it for Ukraine to give up some territory and let it go. And then, okay, Ukraine can go off and do its own thing without Russian either meddling in Ukrainian politics, which is a big problem. It has been since the end of the Cold War, and open territorial invasion. Right? If you could guarantee the Russians wouldn't do that, if the Russians negotiated in good faith and planned to follow that, then it might be worth it. I mean, you got to be somewhat realistic. We all want the Ukrainians to win, whatever, but you got to be realistic, right? I mean, dislodging the Russians from some of these territories militarily is going to be extraordinarily difficult. I think everybody agrees that, barring NATO intervention or nuclear weapons or something really wild, the Russians aren't going to leave Crimea. So if you could actually get the Russians to commit to leave Ukraine alone, I would be willing to accept that deal. My guess is a fair amount of Ukrainians would be willing to do that too. I don't know. But the real problem is just trust, right? I mean, again, I'm in South Korea. We see this in South Korea. South Korea goes and negotiates with the North Koreans, and then they cheat on the deal. So at this point, people are like, why do we talk to the North Koreans? Because they just don't follow through. They don't negotiate in good faith. And that's really the problem, is that just nobody believes that Trump is going to negotiate with Ukraine in bad faith, because the Russians have cheated and defected on deals with the Ukrainians going all the way back to the 1990s and the Budapest agreements and stuff like that on the return of nuclear weapons to Russia and stuff from Ukraine. I mean, the Russians have cheated again and again and again, and they have a long history of meddling in Ukrainian politics. And I don't think anybody really trusts Putin, other than perhaps Trump himself, who seems to think that Putin wants peace. But I'm not sure if the expert community, I'm not sure. I don't believe anybody really in the expert community who's independent of MAGA thinks that's correct, right? That the Russians will come right back. So
I think that's kind of you mentioned the Budapest memorandum. I think that's kind of, history would tell us that perhaps the United States wouldn't respect any sort of security agreement. But Bob, Trump, he said that this proposal to end the war still needs to be fine-tuned after these talks in Geneva, but he's sending Witkoff to Moscow and another envoy to Kyiv. So Trump told reporters that under the plan, Russia would be making concessions. He said their big concession is that they have to stop fighting and they don't take any more land. So if Russia's concession is not taking any more land, that, reading between the lines, that means that they're going to keep the 20% that they currently occupy. So, I mean, surely Ukraine didn't agree to that yesterday in Geneva.
no, I don't think so. And again, even if this is the other problem too, which we haven't really got to, I think we've discussed this before. Even if Ukrainian elites, Zelensky and others around him, agreed to this, the parliament and so on, the Ukrainian public also has to be on board with this, right? Ukraine's a democracy. You can't just sort of shove a deal down their throat and force it on them, right? Part of any kind of a deal would be elections afterwards. And you can imagine that if this deal is widely perceived as unpopular in Ukraine, the public would oppose it, right? The military might oppose it, which could raise sort of civil military control issues in Ukraine. And then when the elections came, because you'd probably have elections in Ukraine once the war ends, you could very easily have someone running to the right of Zelensky saying, we don't accept this deal, right? And that's the other, and so Zelensky has to get enough from the Russians, and those concessions have to be credible enough to the Ukrainian public that the Ukrainian public will accept this deal. And the problem is that the Russians have undercut their credibility by defecting, by reneging on every deal with the Ukrainians for literally like 20 years now, right? And so I think, and that's ultimately the problem, right? Is Trump's got to get something that really ties Putin down, that really ties his hands, so he can't go back to the bad behavior that we've seen in the last decade. And I just don't know if Trump, if he can do it. I don't know if Putin will agree to that. And two, I don't know if Trump actually has the wherewithal and the willingness to push Putin like that, because he so obviously admires Putin. He likes him. He calls Putin his friend a lot. I just don't know if Trump is willing to really push Putin against the wall and get that agreement. I just don't see that.
Well, Bob, on that note, Trump has had 6 ultimatums to Vladimir Putin, and the way in which happens is that he puts out this threat. Russia runs back to the negotiating table. They talk a big game. They say they're willing to negotiate, and then they reject whatever proposal is given to them. And we're back to square one, and they spend a few months or weeks without any sort of threat hanging over their head. But last week, we saw Lindsey Graham say that Donald Trump has told him that he would sign the sanctions package that would essentially slap up to 500% tariffs on any country importing Russian energy. Now, any military analyst has said that this is such a key threat and tactic from the United States essentially could bankrupt Russia within 6 months if it is implemented. Now, it does need to go to the Senate floor to be voted on. Lindsey Graham already has 85 co-sponsors on this, so that would pass. And then it needs to go to the House, where hopefully it does pass. But how imperative is it that Trump pushes Congress to do this now and doesn't use it as an empty threat?
Yeah, my understanding is that this has actually been around for a while, and that the White House is very mixed on
Since
this.
April.
Right? And so, and I mean, we've been here again. I think this is something you and I have discussed in the past. I mean, this idea of sort of really punishing Russia with the sanctions, right? Sort of economic warfare instead of open NATO military intervention. That's a really good way. We know that Russia is basically a petrostate. We know that Russia, I'm going back to the Soviet days in the 80s, Russia's been really dependent on the export of hydrocarbons. This is, I would agree with you, this is actually a pretty key way to push the Russians. We know that Russian oil exports to China and India have been substantial. I mean, that's the real issue, by the way, with the sanctions, right? It was to provoke serious tension between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and India. So there are costs. But again, my sense is that, Trump is dragging his feet on this. I don't know if Trump actually knows enough about U.S. diplomacy with India and China to worry about that. Again, my sense is more is that, Trump believes he has this special relationship with Putin and he really likes him. And, this would be a real breach. Right. Just a few months ago, Trump was saying, we should put Russia back in the G8. Right. And, he's meeting Trump and he's meeting Putin in, Alaska on the red carpet and shaking his hand. And all, Trump just doesn't follow through on this stuff. Right. So, I'll see it when I believe, I'll believe it when I see it. I'm all for it personally. But, but maybe we've been talking about sanctions on Russia from the Trump administration for, 8 months. Right. I mean, that's been floating around for a while. The Europeans want it. They've pushed the U.S. on this repeatedly, and Trump just won't move on it.
Speaking of Europe, Ukraine is facing a serious financial shortfall. It needs funds ASAP to keep fighting the war, basically. There's concerns that they will run out of money in the next few months. So the EU earlier had floated a plan to lend Ukraine around 140 billion euros worth of these frozen Russian assets. They're held in the EU, held in Belgium. Belgium has kind of pushed back on it, wanting alternative plans. So the other option is, instead of using these Russian assets, the EU would collectively borrow money. 27 members would issue joint debt to raise funds, then lend that to Ukraine. So why do you think it's so important for Europe to really step up right now in finding either these frozen Russian assets, which would be the ideal situation to use Russian money to pay for a Russian war, or to collectively borrow money? How important is this for Europe to do this?
Well, Europe's wealthy, right? I mean, Europe is, if the EU as a bloc is, I believe, has a larger GDP than the United States. I mean, European countries are pretty wealthy, so 130 billion. It sounds like a lot, right? But actually, it's not. If you think about having an economy that's like $30 trillion, it's actually not a great deal of money, right? So the idea that this is some huge political lift or economic lift is not really true. It's more of a political lift, and this is the sense that, has been floating around the West for a while, that sort of like Ukraine is like free riding or we're giving away free money. I mean, that idea has been floating around on the far right, the populist right in the West for a long time. So I think that's probably the political hurdle, is like, how do you get sort of, these conservative parties that increasingly complain about Ukraine aid and feel like it's a ripoff. We hear that from Trump a lot. But I mean, but this has been an issue since the beginning, right? I mean, something like Ukraine's GDP, the last time I read about this, Ukraine's GDP has contracted something like 1/3 since the war has begun. I mean, what a surprise, right? I mean, you got bombed out cities and lost territory and people getting killed. I mean, it just doesn't have the productive capacity to generate what it needs. I mean, I think it's actually quite amazing what the Ukrainians have managed to produce with a GDP that's only like 20% the size of Russia's. But you've just, I mean, wars are expensive. Modern wars, particularly, are very, very expensive. Modern munitions are extremely costly. And we know from like the history of the 20th century that modern militaries use enormous amounts of ammunition, particularly artillery. And we've seen this in Ukraine war too, right? Where you have the two sides just using thousands of shells per month. All that has to be purchased. And so my sense is that, yeah, this is the right thing to do. Again, so the alternative is Ukraine collapses, right? And the Russians march to the Dnieper, at least. I mean, maybe the Europeans can live with that. I would argue that it's immoral. I would also argue that it's strategically a huge mistake, because that would reward Putin's aggression. And you can bet that Putin would almost certainly threaten other NATO states in the future. NATO states in the future, like Poland or Finland or the Baltics, right? So I would argue that it's in Europe's long-term strategic interest to keep footing the bill, because the alternative is, Putin mucking around with the Poles, or trying to infiltrate, or subvert the governments in the Baltics. So, I mean, it's expensive, but I would argue the alternatives are worse. And again, I think most of the strategic community accepts that. I think the real debate is more, why isn't the United States more interested in this? And this gets back to this idea of Trump sort of delinking, he doesn't like US allies and stuff like that. But I think in Europe, the intellectual debate over this, I think in Europe is really over. It's really a political question.
Well, Bob, you know, you and I have spoken at great lengths about Trump's unpredictability, but there is a conversation of whether Europe can go at this alone. So the former NATO Secretary General said that he wants, you know, 20,000 troops behind Ukraine's front lines. The coalition of the willing met last night to discuss kind of life after the war for Ukraine. They want to put more work into rebuilding Ukraine. They want, I guess, security to be stronger from the Ukraine side. So they want to shoulder the responsibility more so than Trump and the US. So just a final question, do you think Europe can go at this alone?
I think the economic and demographic capacity is there, which is to say that Europe has a population that's quite large, about 4 times the size of the Russian population, and its economy is about, I think, like 18 times or something like that, or like 15 times Russia's. So the capacity is there. I would argue it's really a political question. You know, I mean, Europe kind of got comfortable living under the American security umbrella for a long time, sort of the peace of the 1990s and stuff like that, right? And the Europeans, you know, militaries got really small. The Europeans didn't have sort of like big force projection and stuff. And so I think Europe, what you're really pushing against is kind of the inertia of the last 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War, right? Where European publics got used to sort of this kind of modern, the end of history, for lack of a better word. And that end of history is coming to an end with the Russians being really aggressive. And I think you're just having a lot of trouble convincing European populations they got to start spending and that this threat is real and the Americans aren't going to do it anymore, right? You can't buck past this. The US anymore. Donald Trump doesn't believe in that stuff. He thinks buck passing is free riding. He thinks it's exploitative. He wants to get out. He wants to attack Venezuela, I guess. You know, we got this huge US Army or Navy now floating around the Caribbean. You know, I mean, Trump he's delinking from European security, right? And so the Europeans can either let the Russians roll over Ukraine or they can start paying. I'm just not sure there's really much of an alternative. I think that's why, by the way, the Europeans have been running off and trying to placate Trump so much, because they're concerned about a precipitous U.S. retrenchment or withdrawal. I don't think that'll happen, but I do think in the next 5 to 10 years that, you know, NATO is going to be substantially more balanced towards the Europeans. Are going to have to spend a lot more.
Professor Robert Kelly, thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you for having me tonight again.